Hi guys, tonight we arrive without ceremony, without warning bells or dramatic music, just as the cold itself once arrived on the American frontier. You're standing at the edge of evening boots, sinking slightly into frozen ground breath, already visible before you have time to think about it. The sky has that washed-out winter colour, pale and hard, like it has been scrubbed clean of warmth. Somewhere far off, wind slides across open land, with a low, steady sound, not loud, not quiet, just persistent. This is the kind of cold that does not rush. It settles in, it waits, and you can feel it doing exactly that around you now. You probably will not survive this, at least not easily. Not without learning quickly how people once slept through nights like this when walls were thin, fires were unreliable, and the dark lasted longer than felt reasonable. That reality check hangs in the air for a moment, sharp and honest, before easing into curiosity instead of fear. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights and let yourself step fully into this night. You are not in a single year or a single storm. What people sometimes call the Ice Age of the Wild West was not glaciers creeping across main streets, or mammoths wandering past cabins. It was something quieter, and in many ways more exhausting. A period in the 19th century when winters across parts of North America grew harsher, longer, and less predictable. Modern climatologists link much of this to the tail end of what is often called the Little Ice Age, a stretch of cooler global temperatures that affected Europe and North America alike. On the frontier that translated into colder nights, deeper freezes and winters that refused to loosen their grip. You feel that refusal now as you begin thinking about sleep. Not rest in the modern sense, not a soft mattress or steady indoor warmth. Sleep here is a negotiation, a careful balance between exhaustion and alertness. People lay down not because they felt safe, but because their bodies demanded it. As darkness thickens, the land itself seems to pull heat away. The ground beneath your feet holds no kindness. One widely accepted historical detail is that frontier winters could drop well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit for days at a time, especially across the plains and higher elevations. That cold seeped upward through boots, through bedding, through walls until it reached bone, and once it arrived, there it lingered. You begin to understand why night was the most dangerous part of the day. There is a curious detail recorded in some settler diaries that feels almost trivial until you picture it clearly. People often described listening to wood snap and crack as temperatures dropped. Not firewood burning. The wood of the cabin itself. Logs shrinking in the cold joints, shifting nails protesting. For someone lying awake on a straw mattress, that sound could feel like the house slowly pulling itself apart around them. A quirky detail perhaps, but one that made sleep shallow and uneasy. Historians still argue whether these extreme winters were more deadly because of temperature alone, or because settlers were so poorly prepared for prolonged cold. Some scholars emphasize climate data, others focus on human decisions. The truth likely sits uncomfortably between the two. You feel that uncertainty now standing between the land and the shelter that barely separates you from it. As you move closer to where you will sleep, your senses sharpen. The air smells dry and faintly metallic the way air does when moisture is frozen out of it. Your skin tightens across your face. Every inhale feels deliberate. Every exhale visible proof that warmth is leaving you. This is where the story truly begins. Not with grand events or famous names, but with ordinary people trying to solve a simple problem. How do you lie still for hours when stillness itself invites cold to claim you? Sleep, you realize, is not passive here. It is active survival. You step inside a rough shelter, and the temperature barely changes. Maybe it rises by a degree or two. Enough to notice, not enough to relax. The light is dim. Firelight flickers weakly, casting shadows that stretch and contract with each movement of flame. The floor is packed earth. The walls are logs in perfectly fitted thin lines of darkness marking where wind will eventually find its way in. A mainstream historical reality is that many frontier cabins were built quickly, prioritizing speed over insulation. There was little time to wait for ideal conditions. You built what you could where you stood before winter fully closed its hand. You take in the space and already understand that sleep will happen here not because the environment allows it, but because the body eventually gives up resisting. People learn to accept discomfort as a constant companion. They learn to lower expectations. Warmth became relative. If you were less cold than the night before, that counted as improvement. There is another odd detail that surfaces in accounts from this era. Some settlers described waking to find frost forming on the inside of their blankets, moisture from breath freezing mid-air settling like fine white dust. Sounds almost beautiful when written down. In practice, it meant dampness, stiffness, and the constant risk that fabric would steal heat instead of holding it. As you prepare to lie down, you become aware of how quiet everything is. Not peaceful quiet, alert quiet, the kind where you listen without realizing you are listening, for wind shifts, for fire changes, for the subtle absence of sound that might mean the flames have died. This awareness follows you towards sleep. You're tired, bone tired. Muscles ache from work done in cold that never quite left your fingers, but closing your eyes feels like a small gamble. You settle into your place, arranging yourself the way people once did, curling slightly, conserving heat, minimizing exposed surface. There is no ceremony to it, just habit learned quickly, or not at all. The night stretches ahead long and unmoving, and as you begin to drift, you carry with you the understanding that sleep on the winter frontier was never about comfort. It was about making it through until morning. Sleep does not come all at once. It arrives in fragments thin and cautious, like an animal testing unfamiliar ground. As you lie there, you begin to realize that the phrase Ice Age of the Wild West is misleading in a way that matters. You're not buried beneath glaciers. There are no towering walls of ancient ice creeping across the plains. Instead, what defines this night is repetition. Night after night of punishing cold. Winter after winter that feels longer than memory can easily hold. This was not a single catastrophic freeze. It was an accumulation of hardship. Many historians describe the mid to late 19th century as a period when frontier settlers faced unusually persistent cold snaps, especially across the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain regions, and parts of the Northern Territories. Records from military forts, homesteads, and trading posts note weeks where temperatures remained far below freezing with little relief, even during daylight. This steady pressure is what earned the era its dramatic nickname. You shift slightly, trying to find a position that keeps your shoulders from aching. The movement sends a small puff of colder air beneath your blankets. You still. Even small adjustments feel expensive now. There is a strange misconception that people of the past were somehow tougher, immune to cold in a way modern bodies are not. In truth, their bodies reacted the same way yours does. Fingers numbed, toes lost sensation. Shivering took over without permission. One well-established historical fact is that hypothermia was a constant, often unrecognized threat. People did not always collapse dramatically. Sometimes they simply failed to wake. A curious and lesser-known detail appears in letters written by settlers who had recently arrived from milder climates. Some wrote that the cold felt different here, sharper, more personal. It was not just the temperature, but the wind, the dryness, and the sheer openness of the land. Without forests or hills to slow it, air moved freely, carrying heat away faster than the body could replace it. That detail helps explain why sleep was so difficult even indoors. Historians still argue whether the nickname Ice Age caused later generations to exaggerate how cold it truly was. Some scholars suggest the term reflects emotional memory more than exact measurements. Others counter that thermometer readings and livestock losses confirm conditions were genuinely extreme, As you lie there, listening to the faint whistle of air finding its way through the walls, the deep beat feels academic. The effect is undeniable. You begin to notice how your breathing has changed. Slower now, more deliberate. Each inhale is careful not to draw in too much cold air too quickly. Each exhale fogs briefly, then vanishes. People learned this rhythm instinctively. Fast breathing wasted heat. Slow breathing conserved it. Outside, the land does nothing to help. Snow reflects moonlight, faintly turning the world into a pale, hard surface that seems to glow with cold rather than light. Inside, shadows tremble with the fire's last movements. You understand that this environment does not allow for deep, unbroken sleep. It allows for endurance. There is an odd comfort in realizing that expectations were different. No one lay down expecting 8 peaceful hours. Sleep was something you took in pieces. 10 minutes here, half an hour there. Waking often to check the fire, to pull a blanket tighter, to reassure yourself that others nearby were still breathing. Another small but telling detail emerges from period accounts. Some settlers timed their sleep around the fire rather than the clock. They learned how long certain fuels burned and set their rest accordingly. Driftwood might last an hour, buffalo chips less. Knowing this determined how deeply you allowed yourself to drift. You feel that calculation happening almost automatically now. Even without intending to, part of your mind stays awake, counting, listening, measuring warmth. This was the reality of sleeping during the coldest years of the frontier. Not dramatic collapse, not heroic resistance, just quiet vigilance. The land did not announce danger loudly. It whispered it steadily until you learn to listen. As your thoughts slow again, you carry forward a clearer understanding. The Ice Age of the Wild West was not a single moment in time. It was a long conversation between people and climate, conducted mostly at night in the dark with eyes half closed and senses fully alert. You become aware of the ground long before you fall fully asleep. Even through layers of bedding, even through whatever insulation has been scraped together, the earth makes its presence known. It pulls heat downward with patience as if gravity itself favours cold. The land here does not offer warmth easily, it keeps it. On the open frontier, frozen soil was one of the greatest enemies of rest. A widely accepted historical reality is that during severe winters the ground could freeze several feet deep across large parts of the plains and mountain regions. That freeze did not stop at the cabin threshold. It crept beneath walls, into floors, into the very space where bodies tried to recover. People learned quickly that sleeping directly on the ground was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. You adjust your position instinctively, curling your knees closer to your chest. This was not just a habit, it was strategy. By reducing surface area exposed to cold, people conserved precious warmth. You notice how even small movements can create new cold pockets beneath blankets. You still yourself again, letting warmth rebuild slowly. There is a peculiar detail found in some frontier journals that seems almost absurd until you picture it clearly. Settlers sometimes layered dried grass newspapers, even old clothing beneath their bedding to create distance from the floor. Newspapers, when available, were prized not for reading but for insulation. Ink-stained pages became silent barriers between flesh and frozen earth. A small, almost humorous detail, yet one that could make the difference between tolerable cold and misery. Historians still argue whether elevation or latitude played the greater role in these brutal sleeping conditions. Some scholars point to high plains and mountain valleys as the worst offenders, where thin air and exposure magnified cold. Others emphasize northern settlements where shorter days and longer nights allowed cold to settle in deeply. Lying here now, you understand that the body does not care which factor wins the debate. Cold feels absolute when it reaches you. The wind outside continues its work. It presses against the shelter not with force but with persistence. Every tiny gap becomes a doorway. Even well-built cabins struggled to keep it out. Logs shrank as temperatures dropped, opening seams that had been tight in warmer months. You feel that infiltration as a faint, almost polite chill brushing past your ankles, your shoulders, your face. Sleep in this environment was shaped by constant awareness of these forces. People placed their beds as far from doors as possible. They avoided corners where air pooled. Some angled bedding slightly aligning themselves with the least exposed wall. These were not comforts, they were calculations. Another often overlooked detail emerges in letters written by women on the frontier. Many described waking with sore hips and stiff joints, not from labour, but from the hardness of their sleeping surfaces. Mattresses, if they existed at all, were thin sacks stuffed with straw or corn husks. Over time, the filling flattened, offering little cushioning. Cold travelled easily through such materials, turning rest into endurance. You shift again, testing the limits of stillness. Your body aches in ways that feel dull rather than sharp. This is the ache of holding tension unconsciously of muscles, refusing to fully relax in an environment that feels hostile. People of the time learned to accept this as normal. Pain was background noise. A mainstream historical fact often noted is that frontier settlers prioritized walls and roofs over floors. Floors came later, if at all. Many cabins had only packed dirt for years. That decision made sense when speed mattered more than comfort, but at night, lying inches above frozen ground, the cost became clear. You notice how the cold feels different depending on where it touches you. It bites at extremities first. Fingers, toes, ears, nose. The core holds on longer. People understood this instinctively even if they lacked modern terminology. They tucked hands under arms, pulled hats, low-wrapped scarves across faces while sleeping. Sleepwear was layered and deliberate. There is a small, almost ironic comfort in knowing that these struggles were shared, that countless others lay awake in similar shelters, listening to similar winds, making similar adjustments. Sleep became a communal experience even when you were alone. As your breathing evens out again, you feel the ground's pull still there, steady and unyielding. It reminds you that this land shaped not only how people worked and travelled, but how they rested. The night does not soften, it waits, and you learn as they did to meet it halfway. As the night deepens, you become aware of another presence in the darkness. Not a sound, not a movement, other bodies. Even if you cannot see them clearly, you sense them nearby. On the winter frontier, sleeping alone was rarely a deliberate choice. It was something you did only when there was no alternative. You shift slightly closer instinct, guiding you before thought does. People learned early that warmth multiplied when bodies shared space. Contemporary accounts from frontier settlements frequently note that families slept together in ways that would feel crowded by modern standards. Parents, children, relatives, and sometimes visitors arranged themselves side by side, layered like kindling, because heat was not something you wasted by spacing it out. You feel how the air changes when another body's close. It is subtle, a faint easing of the cold, a shared pocket where breath and warmth linger a fraction longer. That difference mattered. In extreme winters, it could mean waking up instead of not. There is a small but revealing habit mentioned in several personal journals. People often slept head to foot rather than all facing the same direction. This reduced drafts across faces and allowed warmth to circulate more evenly. It sounds awkward, even uncomfortable, but it was practical. Comfort came second to survival always. Researchers continue to disagree on how much shared sleeping reduced the actual risk of hypothermia versus how much it simply made nights feel more bearable. Some argue that the psychological reassurance alone improved survival by encouraging rest. Others point to basic thermodynamics, noting that clustered bodies clearly slowed heat loss. Lying here now, you understand that the distinction hardly mattered. Relief was relief. You become aware of how carefully people arrange themselves. Children were often placed in the centre, surrounded by adults. Elders, when possible, were given the warmest spots near the fire or furthest from drafts. These choices were rarely discussed aloud. They were understood. Night after night, the same quiet choreography repeated itself. Your body relaxes slightly as shared warmth settles in. Muscles unclench just enough to allow deeper breathing. Even then, sleep remains light. A cough, a shift, a change in breathing rhythm would register immediately. On the frontier, listening to others sleep was a way of monitoring life itself. An unexpected detail emerges from letters written by travellers who joined established households during winter. Some described being surprised by how intimate sleeping arrangements felt, not emotionally, but physically. Privacy faded quickly in the face of cold. Personal space was a luxury reserved for warmer seasons. It is well established that overcrowding increased the spread of illness. Yet in winter, people accepted that risk. Cold was the more immediate threat. The calculation was simple. A fever might come later. Freezing came tonight. You notice how the sounds of the night soften slightly when bodies are near. Breathing creates a rhythm, not synchronized, but overlapping. It becomes a background presence like wind or fire. Familiar, grounding. There is no romance in this closeness, no idealized sense of togetherness. It is practical, efficient, and quietly human. People learned to sleep around one another because the land demanded it. Isolation was not noble, it was dangerous. As your thoughts drift again, you carry with you the understanding that survival here was rarely solitary. Even sleep, the most private of acts, became communal. The night presses in from all sides, but within this small cluster of warmth, it loosens its grip just enough to allow rest. The shelter around you feels solid at first glance. Thick logs, a low roof. Walls meant to stand between you and the open night. But as you lie there longer, you begin to notice how much the cabin participates in the cold rather than resisting it. It breathes, it contracts, it lets winter in. Frontier cabins were often built from green timber cut and stacked quickly before weather turned worse. Period building records and settler descriptions consistently show that these structures shrank as temperatures dropped. Gaps opened between logs, chinking, cracked, and fell away. Air slipped through with quiet determination. You feel those currents now brush in ankles, neck, and face in places you cannot fully protect. You turn, slightly angling your body away from the wall. People learned where drafts travelled. They memorized which corners stayed coldest and which offered relative mercy. Beds were placed strategically, not for aesthetics, but for airflow. The idea of rearranging furniture for comfort did not exist. You arranged yourself for survival. One oddly resourceful practice appears again and again in first-hand accounts. Settlers stuffed spare clothing rags, even dried moss, into wall gaps during winter nights. In the morning, they pulled the material out to use again during the day. Walls became temporary storage for anything that could block air. It was messy, inconvenient, and effective. There is ongoing debate among historians about whether these cabins were ever intended to be warm in a modern sense. Some argue they were designed simply to reduce exposure, not eliminate cold. Others believe settlers expected to improve insulation over time but were constantly overtaken by new demands. Lying here listening to the soft whistle of air moving through wood, you suspect both views hold truth. The roof above you adds its own challenges. Heat rises, and in cabins with poorly sealed ceilings, warmth escaped quickly. Snow sometimes helped by weighing down roofing materials and sealing gaps, but it also increased the risk of collapse. You become aware of faint creaks overhead, not threatening but constant. The structure adjusts itself as temperatures shift. It's widely recognized that many cabins had only a single small window, if any at all. Glass was expensive and fragile. Openings were covered with oiled cloth or animal hide materials that allowed light but offered little insulation. At night, those coverings stiffened, becoming almost as cold as the air outside. You pull your bedding closer, aware that the walls offer limited protection. Cold radiates inward, steady and patient. People learn to sleep with their backs toward interior spaces, turning away from external walls whenever possible. The cabin itself dictated posture. An unexpected observation found in winter letters is how familiar settlers became with the sound of their own homes. They could tell the temperature by how loudly logs cracked, or how sharply the wind whined through certain seams. Sleep became attuned to architecture. You listen now, cataloguing sounds without effort. Some researchers continue to question whether better construction techniques could have significantly improved warmth given the materials available. Others note that even well-built cabins struggled against prolonged cold without modern insulation. What remains clear is that shelters reduced exposure, but they did not defeat winter. As the fire dims and shadows stretch, the cabin seems to settle around you, not as a refuge, but as a fragile buffer. It stands between you and the night, imperfect but essential. Within its limits you rest as best you can, knowing that the structure around you is working just as hard as you are to endure until morning. When the cold grew unbearable above ground, people looked downward. As you lie there thinking about warmth, the idea of earth as shelter begins to make quiet sense. The ground that steals heat at night can also protect it if you place enough soil between yourself and the air. Across the frontier, especially in treeless regions, settlers turned to dugouts and partially buried shelters. Historical surveys of plains homesteads show that these earth homes were common not because they were comfortable, but because they were practical. Soil maintained a more stable temperature than open air. Even in the depth of winter, the earth several feet down remained less hostile than the surface. You imagine lying within one of these spaces, the ceiling low, the walls damp, the smell unmistakable. Earth, clay, straw, smoke clinging to everything. It was not pleasant, but it was warmer, and warmth was the currency that mattered most at night. A small but telling detail appears in accounts from travellers who encountered dugout homes for the first time. Many describe stepping inside and being surprised by the silence. Wind lost its voice underground, sound softened. For people used to prairie storms rattling every surface, this quiet alone made sleep easier. There remains disagreement among researchers about how healthy long-term dugout living truly was. Some emphasize the increased warmth and reduced exposure. Others point to moisture mold and poor ventilation as serious risks. Both perspectives likely hold weight. People traded one set of dangers for another. Inside such shelters, sleeping arrangements followed different rules. Beds were often built directly into walls raised slightly off the floor to avoid dampness. Furs and blankets lined every surface. The goal was not luxury, it was separation. Separation from soil, separation from cold air. You feel how this logic applies even here. The idea of distance between your body and the outside world becomes comforting. Dugouts limited airflow by default. There were fewer gaps, fewer drafts. That reduction alone could mean deeper rest. One unexpected workaround shows up in several personal recollections. Settlers sometimes kept small fires burning all night in dugouts despite the risk of smoke build-up. They regulated airflow, carefully opening vents just enough to breathe just enough to keep flames alive. Falling asleep involved trust and constant awareness. It is well documented that these underground spaces stayed cooler in summer and warmer in winter compared to surface structures. For families facing repeated harsh seasons, dugouts became long-term solutions rather than temporary shelters. Children grew up sleeping within earth walls, learning the smell and feel of soil as normal. You notice how imagining this space changes your breathing. Slower, deeper. The earth feels enclosing rather than exposed. People often wrote about feeling protected underground, even if the space felt crude. Some historians continue to question whether dugouts were an adaptation born of ingenuity or desperation. Likely both. They represented a willingness to reshape living habits entirely in response to climate. Sleep adjusted accordingly. As your thoughts drift, you carry forward the understanding that when the land above refused kindness, people turned to the land beneath. They slept surrounded by soil, not because they wanted to, but because it offered something the open air could not. A quieter cold, a slower loss of warmth, and sometimes a few more hours of rest. The fire never truly leaves your thoughts. Even as your eyes grow heavy, part of you keeps track of its presence. The glow, the crackle, the faint warmth that reaches your skin before slipping away again. On the winter frontier, fire was not just comfort. It was the thin line between rest and danger. Many frontier households relied on fuels that would seem unthinkable today. Wood was not always available, especially on open plains. In those regions, dried buffalo dung became a primary source of heat. It burned slowly, produced steady warmth, and was easier to gather than timber. This detail appears again and again in settlement records and military reports from the plains. Fire here came from the land in whatever form the land allowed. You imagine the smell. Sharp, earthy, unpleasant at first, then familiar. People grew used to it quickly. When your alternative was freezing, preference faded. Warmth became neutral. Anything that worked was acceptable. A small and unexpected habit shows up in winter diaries from this period. Some settlers slept with their feet closest to the fire and their heads angled away. This reduced the risk of sparks and smoke inhalation, while still allowing warmth to reach extremities. It was not a rule taught aloud. It was learned through experience, sometimes harshly. There is still disagreement among scholars about how often fires were left burning through the night. Some evidence suggests constant fires were common in severe weather. Other accounts warn of the dangers and describe letting flames die down before sleep. The truth likely varied by fuel shelter and experience. What remains clear is that everyone measured sleep in relation to the fire. You listen now attuned to the smallest change in sound. A steady crackle means safety. A sudden quiet draws your attention immediately. People train themselves to wake at subtle shifts, even from deep exhaustion. Fire demanded respect. One well-known historical reality is that accidental fires were a major cause of winter deaths on the frontier. Cabins built of dry wood, crowded with bedding and clothing, offered little margin for error. Yet people accepted that risk. Cold posed a more certain threat than flame. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb embers. The heat feels uneven, warming one side of your body more than the other. This imbalance was normal. People rotated positions during the night when possible, sharing the limited warmth, taking turns being closest. There is a revealing detail found in accounts from trappers and traders. Some carried small coals wrapped in cloth when travelling, keeping them alive, long enough to restart fires at new camps. Sleep on the move depended entirely on whether flame could be coaxed back to life before night fully closed in. Experts continue to debate how much smoke exposure affected long-term health. Winter cabins trapped fumes and ventilation was poor. Some argue respiratory illness increased as a result. Others suggest cold itself played a greater role. From where you lie, the smoke stings slightly, but the warmth it brings outweighs discomfort. As your thoughts drift again, you feel the fire's presence even with your eyes closed. It is both companion and threat. It warms, it demands attention. And through the long winter nights of the frontier, sleep learned to orbit around its fragile flickering light. As the fire settles into a quieter rhythm, your attention shifts to what lies directly against your skin. Blankets, hides, layers gathered from necessity rather than design. On the frontier, what you slept under mattered almost as much as where you slept. Written inventories from homesteads and supply posts make one thing clear. Manufactured blankets were scarce and expensive. Wool was prized, but often in short supply. As a result, many people relied on animal hides, stitched pelts, and improvised coverings to trap warmth. These materials were heavy, uneven, and sometimes still carried the faint smell of the animal they once belonged to. Yet they worked. You pull a hide closer now, feeling its weight pressed down gently. That pressure alone offers comfort. Thick furs reduced air movement near the body, creating a small protected layer of warmth. People quickly learned that lighter coverings allowed cold to circulate too freely. Heaviness became an advantage. An overlooked but revealing practice appears in several frontier letters. Settlers often layered bedding in a specific order: fabric closest to the skin, fur on top, additional cloth above that. This arrangement reduced irritation while maximizing insulation. It was not taught formally. It was discovered through cold nights and restless sleep. There is some uncertainty among historians about how clean these sleeping materials truly were. Some argue that frequent exposure to smoke acted as a crude disinfectant. Others believe parasites and grime were common problems. What remains certain is that cleanliness ranked far below warmth on the list of priorities. Comfort came last. You notice how your body responds differently depending on the material touching you. Wool scratches slightly but holds heat well. Fur feels smoother but heavier. Cotton, when available, loses warmth quickly if damp. People became experts without realizing it. Their skin taught them what worked. A commonly accepted observation from the period is that settlers slept with far more layers than they wore during the day. Clothing served double duty. Coats became blankets. Scarves became head coverings at night. Nothing was reserved solely for sleep. Everything contributed to warmth. There is a small, almost humorous detail recorded by a traveller passing through several winter camps. He wrote of hosts apologising for the smell of their bedding, as if odour were a greater offence than cold. It reveals something quietly human. Even in extreme conditions, people retained a sense of normalcy, of standards they could no longer meet but still remembered. As you lie still, you become aware of how moisture affects everything. Breath dampens fabric. Snow trapped inside melts slightly, then refreezes. Dampness steals heat faster than air ever could. People learn to dry bedding whenever possible, hanging blankets near the fire during daylight hours, even if it meant smoke stains and stiff textures. Researchers continue to examine whether animal hides provided better insulation than woven textiles. Some experiments suggest fur performed exceptionally well in still conditions, but lost effectiveness when compressed. Others argue wool maintained more consistent warmth. In practice, settlers used whatever they had, layering without overthinking the physics. You adjust again, careful not to create gaps. Cold finds gaps quickly. People learn to tuck edges, tightly wrapping themselves like parcels. Arms were often kept inside layers rather than at the sides. Heads were covered sometimes completely, with only a small opening left for breath. Sleep under these conditions felt different. Movement was limited. Turning over required effort, but stillness conserved warmth, and warmth allowed rest. That trade-off became familiar. As your breathing deepens, you feel the weight of covering settle more comfortably. The night outside remains unforgiving, but within this layered cocoon, the cold slows its advance. You begin to understand that survival here was stitched together from many small decisions. What you slept under was one of the most important. You do not undress for sleep. The idea barely crosses your mind before it's dismissed. On winter nights like this, removing layers feels reckless, almost arrogant. Clothing is not something you shed at bedtime. It is something you rearrange. Across frontier settlements, it was widely understood that sleeping fully dressed reduced heat loss and shortened the dangerous period between lying down and achieving warmth. Shirts, trousers, socks, vests, coats, even boots in some cases remained on through the night. This was not laziness. It was strategy shaped by long exposure to cold that punished hesitation. You feel the stiffness of fabric as you settle. Sleeves bunch slightly at the elbows. Seams press into skin. None of it is comfortable in a modern sense, but each layer traps air, and trapped air slows the escape of heat. People learned this without needing explanation. Their bodies taught them quickly. There is a quietly revealing habit mentioned in several winter accounts. Some settlers loosened belts and laces before sleep, allowing blood to circulate more freely while keeping garments in place. Too tight and extremities numbed faster. Too loose and heat escaped. Sleep involved constant small adjustments. The question of whether sleeping dressed increased the risk of illness remains unresolved among researchers. Some argue damp clothing worn overnight led to chills and sickness. Others counter that removing layers in freezing shelters posed a far greater threat. The balance likely depended on moisture material and individual health. For most, warmth outweighed every other concern. You become aware of how your clothing smells: smoke, sweat, earth. These scents are familiar rather than unpleasant. They signal survival. Cleanliness had little relevance here. Dryness mattered far more. Wet fabric pressed cold directly against skin, and that was something people avoided at all costs. One detail that surprises many modern readers appears in journals kept by frontier women. Nightgowns were often layered over day clothes rather than replacing them. The garment added warmth and modesty without sacrificing insulation. Sleepwear was not delicate, it was functional. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb your layers. Each movement risks creating pockets where cold air can creep in. People learned to settle into positions that minimized motion. Side sleeping with knees drawn up was common. It conserved heat and reduced exposure. There is also evidence that hats were worn through the night. Heat escapes quickly from the head, and covering it helped maintain core temperature. Some people wrapped scarves across their mouths and noses while sleeping, breathing through fabric to warm incoming air. It felt awkward, but it worked. Travellers passing through winter camps often commented on how rigid sleepers appeared at night. Bodies wrapped, layered and still. It was not fear that kept them motionless. It was efficiency. Movement wasted warmth. Medical observers of the time occasionally noted that people who undressed fully were more likely to suffer from frost-related injuries during the night. This was not formal research, but repeated observation. Experience became instruction. You notice how your own body responds now. Muscles relax only part way. There is always a sense of readiness. Clothing holds warmth close, but it also reminds you of the cold beyond it. Sleep here never fully disconnects from awareness. Some scholars suggest that sleeping dressed altered how people experience rest itself. Dreams were lighter, sleep cycles shorter, waking more frequent. Others argue exhaustion eventually overcame discomfort. Both likely occurred. Sleep adapted to conditions, becoming flexible rather than deep. There is a small human moment captured in one diary entry that lingers. A settler described waking in the night to adjust his collar around his child's neck, tucking fabric closer to prevent cold air from slipping in. He did not fully wake. His hands moved from habit. Warmth was protected even in half sleep. You feel that same instinct now. Layers matter. Every fold matters. Sleep is not surrender. It is careful balance. As the night stretches on, you begin to drift more fully. Your clothing becomes less noticeable, merging into the background of sensation. The cold does not vanish, but it slows. That is enough. For people of the frontier, sleeping dressed was not a compromise. It was one of the quiet rules that kept mornings possible. You sensed the order of the room even with your eyes closed. Not an order imposed by furniture, but one shaped by need. Bodies closest to warmth. Those most vulnerable placed where the night reached them last. On the winter frontier, sleep revealed priorities more clearly than daylight ever could. It was commonly observed in household records and personal letters that children and older adults were positioned nearest the fire or most sheltered walls. This was not sentimental, it was practical. Smaller bodies lost heat faster. Aging bodies recovered it more slowly. Families arrange sleep accordingly, night after night, with little discussion. You feel that logic in the way the space is organized around you. Warmth concentrates toward the center. The edges are colder, sharper. People who could tolerate discomfort took those places without complaint. Strength was measured by endurance, not comfort. A subtle but meaningful practice appears in recollections from winter camps. Infants were sometimes wrapped and placed between adults rather than in separate bedding. This created a shared warmth that benefited everyone involved. It also meant sleep was light interrupted by movement and breath. Rest was sacrificed for safety. There is no full agreement among modern researchers on how much these arrangements reduced mortality during extreme winters. Some evidence suggests they made a significant difference, especially for children. Other studies caution that overcrowding increased the spread of disease. The balance between warmth and illness was delicate, and choices were made without the benefit of hindsight. You notice how attention lingers on breathing patterns. A change in rhythm would be felt immediately. People learn to listen without waking fully. Nighttime care was quiet, instinctive, and constant. It's also recorded that in mixed-age households, younger adults often slept closest to doors or drafty walls. These spots offered the least protection. Taking them was understood as responsibility rather than sacrifice. Sleep roles reflected daytime labour roles extending duty into the night. There is a small telling observation found in one woman's winter diary. She wrote of waking several times to pull a blanket higher over her mother's shoulders, each time careful not to disturb her fully. That gesture was repeated across countless households, rarely recorded yet essential. As you lie there, the presence of others shapes your own rest. You're aware of shared warmth, shared vulnerability. Sleep is not private, it is collective. Some scholars propose that these nightly arrangements reinforce social bonds, creating a sense of interdependence that carried into daily life. Others argue the closeness was purely circumstantial, dissolving as soon as conditions allowed. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Necessity can create habits that feel like connection. The fire shifts, sending a brief wave of warmth across the room. You feel it first, then sense others respond almost imperceptibly. A leg moves, a shoulder adjusts, no one speaks. Morning when it comes will undo this arrangement quickly. Daylight restores distance. But for now the night holds everyone close. As your thoughts slow again, you rest within this quiet system of care. It is unspoken, efficient, and deeply human. In the coldest seasons of the frontier, sleep was not just rest. It was how families protected one another until dawn. Even as sleep deepens, part of your awareness remains tethered to the fire. It is not fear that keeps you listening. It is habit. On nights like this, flame is not background. It is signal. People who lived through frontier winters learn to recognize the smallest changes in sound. A healthy fire spoke in low, steady pops. When that sound faded or shifted, it stirred the room. Letters from settlers often mention waking before dawn to revive embers sometimes without fully remembering doing so later. The body responded before the mind did. You lie still, ears tuned. A faint collapse of coals draws your attention. Not urgent yet, just noted. Sleep adjusts around that awareness, bending rather than breaking. There is an overlooked practice that surfaces in several camp accounts. Some families placed a metal object, often a pot or tool, near the fire so that its cooling sound signaled fading heat. A change in tone served as an alarm without clocks or watches. It was a quiet innovation born of need. The question of how deeply people slept under these conditions remains open. Some scholars believe constant vigilance prevented true rest. Others argue the body adapted, allowing deeper sleep between brief awakenings. Evidence supports both views depending on individual circumstance and severity of cold. You sense how this state feels, not fully awake, not fully asleep, a drifting awareness that floats just above unconsciousness. People became comfortable here. It was safer than complete surrender. Medical writings from the 19th century note that people exposed to extreme cold often experienced heightened sensitivity to sound during rest. Whether this was physiological adaptation or simple anxiety is still uncertain. From inside the experience, it feels automatic. Listening happens without effort. A small detail found in one winter journal describes a man waking instantly when a coal rolled and sparked, even though he slept through louder noises earlier in the night. The brain prioritized threats related to warmth and fire above all else. Sleep learned new rules. You feel your own breathing adjust to match the rhythm of the room. The fire crackles softly again. Relief follows, subtle but real. Muscles loosen a fraction. You drift deeper. Some researchers suggest this constant monitoring shaped long-term sleep patterns, contributing to lighter sleep even in warmer months. Others believe the effect faded when danger passed. Both interpretations appear in personal recollections, varying from person to person. What remains consistent is the relationship between rest and responsibility. Sleep was never separate from survival tasks. It included them. Listening became part of resting, not an interruption of it. As the night stretches on, you find yourself slipping into that same balance, conscious enough to respond, relaxed enough to recover. It is not the sleep you know from modern life, but it works. The fire holds. The room remains still, and within this fragile quiet rest continues shaped by sound habit and the knowledge that morning depends on attention as much as exhaustion. The wind becomes the loudest thing once the fire settles. Not a single sound, but layers of motion passing over open land. It presses, withdraws, returns again, never quite repeating itself. On the winter prairie, wind was not weather. It was a presence that shaped how you slept. Frontier weather records and military post logs describe winter winds strong enough to move snow sideways for days at a time. These were not brief gusts. They were sustained flows that stripped heat from everything they touched. Even well-sheltered cabins felt their influence. You hear it now, sliding along walls, finding seams, making the structure answer back with faint creaks. You pull your covering closer to your face, not because it helps much, but because instinct demands it. Wind has a way of convincing the body that more cold is coming, even when temperature remains the same. People learn to respond early rather than wait. One small but telling habit appears in accounts from those who slept through major prairie storms. Many placed objects against doors and walls, not just to block drafts, but to change the sound of the wind. A softer noise made sleep possible. A whistling seam could keep a room awake all night. Altering sound became as important as altering temperature. There is no firm agreement among climate historians about whether wind chill was fully understood at the time. Thermometers measured air temperature, not how cold it felt against skin. Yet people grasped the concept intuitively. They knew that a still night at 0 felt different than a windy night at 10 above. Sleep adjusted accordingly. You notice how your body responds to louder gusts. Muscles tense briefly. Breathing becomes shallower. Then as the wind passes, you loosen again. This cycle repeats sometimes dozens of times an hour. Over time, people stopped reacting consciously. The body learned which sounds mattered. An unexpected observation from winter letters is how storms altered perception of space. Cabins felt smaller when wind pressed hard against them, as if the night were trying to force its way inside. Some settlers wrote of feeling enclosed rather than exposed during blizzards, a rare comfort in an otherwise hostile season. It is well documented that wind-driven snow could enter shelters through gaps in walls and roofs. People sometimes woke to find drifts forming indoors. This was not panic-inducing. It was routine. Snow was brushed aside, bed-and-shaken sleep resumed if possible. Cold demanded pragmatism. You listen to the rhythm of the storm now. It has its own pattern, a rise, a pause, a long push. This predictability allows rest to settle more deeply. The mind relaxes when it can anticipate. Some scholars question whether constant exposure to wind noise increased long-term stress among settlers. Others suggest familiarity reduced its impact. From within the experience, the sound becomes background like the sea to sailors, annoying at first, eventually neutral. A small human detail emerges from a journal kept by a woman during a particularly violent winter. She wrote of naming the wind, speaking to it softly, as if it were an unruly guest. It didn't stop the noise, but it made the night feel less adversarial. Language became comfort. You find yourself doing something similar without realizing it. Counting gusts, measuring their length, turning noise into pattern. Sleep arrives more easily when chaos feels organized. The wind continues its work outside, reshaping drifts, erasing tracks, sealing the world away. Inside, the shelter holds imperfect but sufficient. You rest within that thin margin, aware that the storm will pass when it chooses. As your thoughts drift again, the sound of wind becomes steady, almost soothing. It fills the dark, leaving less room for worry. In the coldest winters of the frontier, even the wind became part of the sleeping environment, something to be endured, learned, and finally absorbed into rest. The warmth you feel next does not come from fire or fabric. It comes from movement, slow breathing, a faint shift of weight nearby. Animals were never far from winter sleep on the frontier, and that closeness was rarely sentimental. It was practical, immediate, and sometimes uncomfortable. Across ranches, homesteads, and temporary camps, people brought animals close during the coldest nights. Horses, cattle, dogs, even chickens were sheltered near human sleeping spaces whenever possible. Barns were attached to living quarters. Lean-tos shared walls with stalls. Heat moved through wood and earth, whether invited or not. This arrangement shows up repeatedly in settlement layouts and agricultural records from the period. You imagine the sound first, the low shuffle of hooves, a horse exhaling slowly in the dark, the soft cluck of a bird settling. These sounds were not interruptions, they were reassurance. Living bodies meant warmth still circulated nearby. There is a quietly surprising detail found in winter accounts from both settlers and soldiers. Dogs were often allowed to sleep directly on beds or bedding during extreme cold. Not as pets in the modern sense, but as shared heat sources. One body warmed another. Fur-trapped air. Everyone benefited. Complaints about space disappeared when temperatures dropped. Whether this practice significantly improved survival rates remains uncertain. Some researchers suggest animals made a measurable difference by raising ambient temperatures in enclosed spaces. Others argue the psychological comfort mattered more than the heat itself. From the inside, the distinction blurs. Warmth and reassurance feel nearly identical at night. You notice how animals sleep differently than people. Their breathing is steady, their bodies relax fully, they trust the space. That calm spreads. Many settlers wrote about falling asleep more easily when livestock were nearby, even if the smell was strong and the floor crowded. It is known that in the harshest winters people sometimes brought young or injured animals indoors entirely. Calves and lambs were kept near stoves or hearths wrapped loosely in cloth. This was not indulgence. Losing livestock meant losing food, labour, and future security. Protecting animals meant protecting survival. You feel the air shift slightly as a larger body nearby adjusts its stance. The warmth that follows is subtle but real. Heat radiates outward, slow and steady. People learn to position themselves near shared walls, knowing warmth would seep through. Nighttime planning included livestock placement. An unusual workaround appears in one trader's journal. He described sleeping with his boots against a cow's flank to keep leather from freezing solid overnight. It sounds strange, almost comical, but frozen boots could delay travel or cause injury. Animals solved problems without words. There is disagreement among historians about how sanitary these arrangements were. Some argue close quarters increased disease risk. Others point out that cold temperatures limited bacterial spread during winter months. In either case, settlers accepted the trade-off. Illness was a future concern. Freezing was immediate. You become aware of smell now. Hay, animal breath, manure. These scents blend into the background. Over time, they stop registering as unpleasant. Familiar smells signal continuity. They mean things are as expected. Horses in particular played a role in nighttime warmth. Their body heat was substantial, and when stabled close it raised temperatures in adjacent rooms by several degrees. People learned to value this effect, even designing shelters to take advantage of it. Warmth travelled through shared walls and packed earth floors. Some observers noted that animals themselves seemed to seek human proximity during storms. Dogs curled against legs, cats settled into bedding piles, chickens roosted lower. Whether instinct or habit, this mutual clustering reduced heat loss for all involved. You feel how this presence changes the night. Silence softens. Loneliness fades. Sleep comes more readily when the space feels inhabited. The frontier could be isolating by day. At night, animals filled that void with sound and warmth. There is no romance in this closeness. It is noisy. It smells. It requires clean-up in the morning, but it works, and that was enough. As your thoughts drift again, you rest with the knowledge that survival on the frontier extended beyond human effort alone. Animals shared the burden of winter nights. Their body gave warmth. Their presence gave comfort. And in the quiet hours before dawn, that partnership allowed sleep to deepen just a little more. Before sleep could truly take hold, there was one more calculation to make. Food, not taste, not pleasure, just fuel. On the winter frontier, what you ate before lying down often determined how warm the night would feel. Accounts from settlers, trappers, and soldiers consistently show that evening meals were heavier during cold spells. Fat and protein were favoured because they burned, slowly releasing heat over time. Salt pork beans, tallow-hard bread soaked in grease. These were not comforting foods, but they kept the body working through the night. People understood this relationship instinctively, even without modern nutrition science. You feel that warmth now deep and internal. It does not radiate like fire. It steadies you from within. Digesting food becomes part of staying alive. Sleep works better when the body has something to burn. A small but revealing habit appears in winter journals from remote posts. Some people saved a portion of their meal specifically to eat just before sleep, even if it meant going hungry earlier in the day. That timing mattered. Warmth delayed until night was more valuable than comfort at noon. There is still no full consensus among researchers on how much nighttime eating improved survival versus simply improving comfort. Some argue calories alone could not overcome exposure. Others point out that the body's heat production during digestion clearly reduced risk during long cold nights. From the perspective of someone lying in the dark, the benefit feels undeniable. You notice how hunger sharpens the cold. An empty stomach seems to invite chill inward. Settlers wrote about nights when food ran low as being colder than nights with full bellies, even when temperatures were the same. Perception and physiology intertwined. It is documented that warm drinks were prized before sleep whenever fuel allowed. Broth, weak tea, coffee stretched thin, even hot water helped. The warmth did not last long, but it offered a brief easing that made settling easier. Cups were shared. Every swallow counted. An unexpected detail appears in one traveller's account. He described chewing fat slowly before sleep, not swallowing right away, letting it coat his mouth and throat. He believed it helped keep cold air from biting when he breathed. Whether this worked physically or psychologically remains uncertain, but the habit stuck with him. Food storage affected sleep as well. Knowing supplies were low made rest harder. Worry kept minds active even when bodies were exhausted. Some settlers described dreaming of food during winter, waking briefly with hunger that felt sharper in the cold. Medical observers of the era noted that malnourished individuals struggled more with nighttime cold even when sheltered. Weight loss reduced insulation. Muscle loss reduced heat generation. Sleep became lighter, more fragile. Bodies without reserves could not relax. You feel your own muscles loosen slightly, now aided by that internal warmth. Breathing deepens, the fire may fade, the wind may press, but your body has something to work with. There is debate among historians about whether frontier diets adapted quickly enough to winter conditions. Some argue settlers learned fast increasing fat intake deliberately. Others believe shortages forced constant compromise. Likely both occurred depending on location and fortune. One quiet moment captured in a winter letter lingers. A mother wrote of giving her last piece of meat to her child before bed, believing warmth mattered more than her own hunger. She did not frame it as sacrifice. It was simply the correct choice for the night ahead. You rest with that understanding. Sleep here is layered, fire outside, fabric around, food within. Each piece supports the others. Remove one and rest becomes harder to reach. As your thoughts slow again, the warmth from eating settles into a steady presence. It does not chase the cold away, but it pushes back just enough. On the frontier, that was often all the body needed to make it through until morning. At some point in the night, the boundary between inside and outside blurs completely. You sense it not through sight, but through temperature, through dampness, through the way the air suddenly feels heavier against your skin. Snow has found a way in. On the winter frontier, this was not rare. Storms driven by relentless wind pushed fine snow through cracks in walls, roofs and door frames. Settler letters and military outpost reports describe waking to white powder, scattered across floors, bedding even faces. Shelters slowed winter down, but they did not stop it. You feel a faint chill against your cheek and brush it away without fully waking. The snow is dry, almost dusty, but it melts slowly where it touches skin, leaving cold dampness behind. People learn to react calmly. Panic wasted heat. A few motions, a shake of blankets, and rest resumed. There is a quietly remarkable detail noted in several first-hand accounts. Some settlers deliberately left snow that blew inside until morning, believing brushing it away immediately stirred colder air and made the room feel worse. Whether this was accurate or simply habit is unclear, but the practice shows how carefully people observe their environment even half asleep. Researchers still differ in their interpretation of how much indoor snow contributed to illness or injury. Some suggest damp bedding increased risk of frostbite and sickness. Others argue the real danger came from exposure before reaching shelter. For those living it, the concern was immediate comfort, not long-term theory. You notice how the sound of snow differs from rain. It does not patter, it whispers, a faint hiss as it sluds and settles. That sound often blended with wind, creating a constant background that made silence feel unfamiliar. It is known that during severe blizzards, doors could be blocked shut by drifts. People slept knowing that exit might not be possible until morning. This awareness influenced how close they stayed to warmth and how carefully they conserved energy. Night became a waiting period rather than rest. An unexpected habit appears in some winter journals. Settlers sometimes placed extra cloth or hides over doors and windows during storms, not fastening them tightly, but letting them hang loose to catch snow before it entered the room. These makeshift barriers were adjusted throughout the night as conditions changed. You feel the cold intensify briefly as a gust forces more air inside. Your body responds automatically, curling tighter, reducing exposed skin. Muscles remember this posture. Sleep becomes shallower, but it continues. Some observers later questioned why people didn't build more airtight shelters. Others point out that materials and time were limited and that complete sealing risked suffocation from smoke. Winter survival involved constant compromise. Blocking snow meant allowing some air. Allowing air meant enduring cold. A small human moment surfaces from one account written after a particularly brutal storm. A man described waking to find snow covering his wife's hair and shoulders. He brushed it away gently, then pulled her closer using his own body as a barrier. He returned to sleep without comment. Such moments rarely made it into official records, but they shaped nightly survival. You become aware now of how the room smells different when snow enters. Cleaner, sharper, the scent of cold itself. It wakes you slightly, then fades as your senses adjust. By morning, snow inside the shelter would be swept away, shaken from bedding melted near the fire. It became another chore, another inconvenience. At night, it was simply something to manage. As your breathing steadies again, you accept the presence of snow as part of the environment rather than an intrusion. The frontier offered no sealed spaces. Everything was permeable. Sleep adapted accordingly. You drift again, wrapped in layers, aware that winter has crossed the threshold, but not alarmed. This was the reality of rest during the coldest seasons. Snow inside the room did not signal failure. It signaled endurance. Sleep on the move feels different from sleep at home, even in good weather. In winter, it becomes something else entirely. You sense it now as you imagine lying down not in a cabin, but wherever the trail allows, beside a wagon, under canvas, against a rise of frozen earth. For travellers on the frontier, night did not wait for shelter. Trail journals and military march records show that winter travel often continued out of necessity. Mail routes, supply runs, migrations and patrols did not pause simply because temperatures dropped. When darkness arrived, people slept where they stood, adapting quickly to what little protection they could create. You picture the ground beneath you, uneven, hard, the cold pressing up through everything. Travellers learned to clear snow down to earth rather than lie directly on drifts, believing the soil, though frozen, offered more stability. Whether this truly improved warmth is debated, but it became common practice. A quietly inventive habit appears in several wagon trail accounts. People position themselves beneath wagons at night using the frame as a windbreak. Canvas and wood blocked some airflow, creating a pocket where heat lingered longer. It was not comfortable, but it reduced exposure. There is no clear agreement among researchers about how often travellers used fires while sleeping along winter routes. Some sources suggest fires were avoided to conserve fuel and avoid drawing attention. Others describe small, carefully managed flames kept alive through the night. Conditions likely dictated choice. Wind visibility and supplies all mattered. You notice how sleep posture changes when shelter is absent. Bodies curl tighter, arms tuck in. Backs turn instinctively away from open wind. People slept facing the same direction, aligning themselves with the land to reduce drafts. It is documented that travellers often slept in shifts during severe weather. One or two remained awake to tend fires, watch animals, or monitor conditions, while others rested briefly. Sleep became communal labour rather than individual recovery. An unexpected detail surfaces from a soldier's winter letter. He described stuffing snow into his boots before sleep to prevent leather from cracking. The moisture froze, keeping the shape intact until morning. The method sounds counterintuitive, but frozen leather could still be worn. Cracked leather could not. You feel the mental strain of such nights. The body wants to rest. The mind resists fully letting go. Awareness stays just high enough to respond if something changes. People learn to accept this as normal. Deep sleep was rare. Enough sleep was enough. Some scholars suggest that repeated nights of fragmented rest took a long-term toll on travellers, slowing reaction times and increasing risk. Others point out that people adapted learning to function on less continuous sleep. Evidence supports both views. Survival required flexibility. Animals added complexity to these nights. Horses needed shelter from wind. Oxen had to be positioned carefully to avoid freezing. Dogs often slept close, sharing heat and serving as early warning. Managing animals was part of managing sleep. You imagine waking before dawn, stiff fingers slow to respond, breath fogging heavily. Sleep had been shallow, but it carried you through the worst hours. Morning meant movement, which brought warmth back slowly. One brief note from a pioneer journal captures the experience simply. He wrote that winter sleep on the trail was not meant to be remembered. It existed only to bridge one day to the next. Comfort had no role, continuity did. As your thoughts settle, you recognize that sleep without shelter demanded a different relationship with the body. You listened more, you moved less. You accepted discomfort as temporary rather than alarming. The night on the frontier did not always provide walls. When it did not, people slept anyway, against wagons, beneath open sky, within thin margins of protection. And when dawn came, survival counted as success. As the night stretches on, you begin to sense knowledge moving quietly through the darkness. Not written instructions, not formal lessons, Practical understanding passed from one person to another, often without ceremony. Much of what allowed settlers to sleep through brutal winters did not originate with them at all. Long before wagons arrived, indigenous communities across North America had already mastered winter survival in these landscapes. Their sleeping practices reflected generations of observation. Settlers noticed this quickly. In regions where winters proved overwhelming, they borrowed techniques that worked sometimes without fully understanding why. You imagine the difference immediately. Sleeping platforms raised from the ground, beds layered with grasses and hides in careful order, shelters shaped to shed wind rather than resist it. These approaches appear repeatedly in frontier accounts, written by newcomers who survived their first winters by copying what they saw. A particularly revealing habit shows up in multiple records. Some settlers adopted the practice of placing evergreen branches beneath bedding. The needles trapped air, created insulation, and released a faint scent that made the space feel cleaner. It was a simple solution, easily overlooked yet remarkably effective. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how willingly this knowledge was shared versus quietly observed and taken. Some evidence suggests direct instruction occurred especially in trading regions. Other accounts imply settlers learned by watching rather than asking. Either way, the exchange shaped winter survival in lasting ways. You feel how these techniques change sleep itself. Elevated bedding reduces the ground's pull. Layered natural materials adjust to the body more flexibly than straw alone. The night feels less aggressive, still cold, but less personal. It is well known that some indigenous groups slept communally in winter, clustering bodies and sharing heat much like frontier families later did. Others used individual bedding arrangements designed to retain warmth efficiently. There was no single method. Adaptation matched environment. One unexpected detail recorded by a trader describes learning to sleep with his head oriented away from prevailing winds even inside a shelter. This reduced cold airflow across the face and made breathing easier. He credited this small adjustment with allowing deeper rest. Some scholars continue to debate how much frontier survival depended on indigenous knowledge versus trial and error among settlers themselves. The reality likely combines both. But the overlap in techniques is clear. When cold-imposed rules, effective solutions converged. You notice how these borrowed practices feel intuitive once adopted. They align with the body rather than fighting it. Sleep becomes something you cooperate with instead of endure. There is also evidence that some settlers misunderstood or only partially adopted these methods, limiting their effectiveness. Raised beds without proper insulation still lost heat. Hides used without adequate layering compressed and failed. Knowledge worked best when applied fully. You sense the quiet respect embedded in these practices. They are not dramatic, they do not promise comfort, they simply reduce harm. In winter that mattered more than innovation. As your thoughts slow again, you recognize that frontier sleep was shaped by many hands across time. Techniques refined over centuries did not vanish when borders shifted. They persisted quietly each night someone lay down and survived until morning. The cold remains, the night remains. But within this borrowed wisdom rest comes a little easier. Sleep becomes less of a gamble, and more of a practiced skill learned from those who understood winter long before the frontier had a name. As the hours wear on, another concern settles quietly into your thoughts. Not hunger, not fire, your own body. Winter nights carried risks that did not always announce themselves loudly. Illness crept in softly, often mistaken for simple fatigue. Frontier medical notes and personal letters describe cold-related injuries as common and often underestimated. Frostbitten fingers, numbed toes, stiff joints that refused to bend by morning. These were not dramatic emergencies. They were slow accumulations noticed only when movement became difficult. Sleep played a role in this, sometimes protecting, sometimes exposing. You lie still aware of sensation fading slightly in your extremities. It is not painful. That is what makes it dangerous. People learned to wake themselves periodically, flexing fingers and toes beneath blankets to keep circulation moving. It was a habit developed without instruction, guided by discomfort and memory. A small but revealing practice appears in winter journals kept by soldiers and settlers alike. Some slept with one hand pressed against their chest or stomach rotating hands through the night to keep each warm in turn. The motion was subtle, often done half asleep, but it preserved feeling. There remains uncertainty among researchers about how much sleep itself contributed to frost injury. Some argue stillness allowed cold to settle deeper. Others point out that rest conserved energy needed to generate heat. Both ideas appear in period observations, sometimes contradicting one another. People balanced risk as best they could without clear answers. You notice how illness feels different in the cold. A cough lingers longer. A fever chills instead of warms. Bodies already working hard to stay warm had little reserve to fight sickness. Many settlers wrote about dreading nightfall. When someone in the household was unwell, sleep became watchfulness. It is documented that people often slept closer together when illness appeared, sharing warmth, even if contagion was possible. Cold felt like the greater enemy. Care was physical before it was medical. An unexpected detail emerges from one woman's account of tending her family through a severe winter. She described warming stones near the fire, wrapping them in cloth, and placing them near aching limbs during the night. The stones cooled slowly, offering comfort without flame. This simple method appears in several regions, passed quietly between households. You become aware of how breath sounds change when someone is sick, shallow, irregular. People learn these sounds intimately, listening even while resting. Sleep remained light when illness was present. Some historians question whether frontier communities understood hypothermia as a condition distinct from general sickness. Others believe practical knowledge existed even without terminology. People recognized warning signs, confusion, slurred speech, unusual drowsiness. Sleep became something to manage carefully rather than surrender to. You feel the weight of blankets, now reassuring but not smothering. The body balances between conserving warmth and avoiding stillness that numbs. Muscles tense briefly, then release. One brief line from a winter letter captures the anxiety simply. A man wrote that he woke often to check that his children were still warm, not because they complained, but because silence worried him. Quiet could mean rest. It could also mean something else. As the night continues, you understand that sleep on the frontier carried responsibility, even when exhaustion pressed hard. It was not only about resting yourself, but about noticing others, listening for signs that required action. The cold remains indifferent. Illness does not announce itself clearly. But within this fragile awareness, people learn to navigate nights carefully, resting when possible, waking when necessary, always measuring the body's response. You drift again, aware of your breathing, your hands the faint warmth near your core. Sleep returns not as escape, but as cautious trust. In winter, trust was never complete. It was enough to last until morning. As sleep finally deepens, something subtle begins to change inside your mind. The cold does not disappear, but it loosens its grip on your thoughts. Dreams arrive differently here, shorter, fragmented, often vivid in strange, uneven ways. People who endured extreme winter conditions frequently described dreams that blurred into waking moments. Frontier letters and later recollections note that exhaustion combined with cold altered how sleep felt. Nights were filled with half-dreams that dissolved quickly, leaving impressions rather than stories. You experience that now. Images surface, then fade before you can hold them. You notice how your body feels heavier, slower to respond, as if wrapped not only in blankets but in thick air. Cold affected circulation, and that influenced sleep cycles. When the body worked constantly to stay warm, the mind followed a different rhythm. Rest came in waves rather than long stretches. A curious observation appears in several personal accounts from winter settlements. People often dreamed of warmth, sunlit rooms, summer fields, fireplaces that never faded. These dreams were not dramatic. They were simple, almost dull. Yet waking from them felt disorienting, making the cold seem sharper by contrast. There is ongoing discussion among sleep researchers who study historical environments about whether hypothermia and chronic cold increased dream frequency or simply made dreams more memorable. Some argue the brain clung to comforting imagery as a coping mechanism. Others suggest disrupted sleep made dream recall easier. The evidence leans in multiple directions. You feel your own thoughts slip oddly. Time stretches. Minutes feel longer. Then suddenly they vanish. This distortion was commonly reported by people wintering in isolated conditions. Without clocks, without consistent sleep cycles, the night lost its structure. It is recorded that some settlers mistook early signs of hypothermia for restful sleep. A sense of calm, a fading urge to move. This made cold particularly dangerous. People learned to distrust sudden comfort, waking themselves or others when stillness felt too deep. An unexpected habit appears in one winter journal kept by a trader far from settlement. He wrote of quietly reciting familiar words before sleep prayers or songs remembered from childhood, not for faith alone but to anchor the mind to prevent drifting too far inward. Language kept him present. You notice how your breathing shifts during these moments, slower but uneven. The body hovers between rest and alertness. Muscles twitch lightly. Fingers curl and uncurl beneath layers. Sleep is happening, but cautiously. Some scholars believe that repeated exposure to such sleep altered long-term patterns, making people more tolerant of interruption and discomfort. Others argue the effect was temporary fading once warmth returned. Accounts vary widely. Some settlers remembered winters decades later as exhausting beyond description. Others spoke of adapting surprisingly quickly. You experience both possibilities now. There is strain but also adjustment. The body learns new limits. The mind learns new shortcuts to rest. A small but telling detail appears in one woman's recollection of a particularly cold winter. She described recognizing the moment when dreams stopped and waking thoughts returned not by sight or sound, but by feeling cold creep back in. Warmth marked sleep. Cold marked waking. As you drift again, dreams soften. They lose shape. They become more like sensations than images. A glow. A sense of movement. Then, nothing at all. The night continues without ceremony. Sleep here is not escape. It is altered consciousness shaped by environment. Cold presses from the outside. Fatigue pulls from within. Somewhere between them, rest survives. You remain there now, breathing steadily, thoughts loose and unclaimed. The frontier night does not offer deep, luxurious sleep. It offers something quieter. Enough rest to carry you forward. Enough stillness to face morning when it comes. When the storm finally passes, it does not announce its departure. You realize it is gone only because something is missing. The pressure against the walls eases. The air stills. Silence settles into the space heavier than any sound that came before. People who slept through winter blizzards often wrote about this moment. Not relief exactly, but alertness. The quiet felt unfamiliar after hours or days of wind. Ears strained to understand it. On the frontier, sudden calm could signal safety, or it could mean something worse had changed. You lie still listening. No whine of wind through gaps, no hiss of drifting snow, just the soft sounds of breath and the faint crack of cooling embers. This silence presses inward, making the shelter feel both protected and isolated. Military journals and settler letters alike describe mornings after storms as some of the coldest. With wind gone, temperatures often dropped sharply. Heat that had been stirred by moving air now vanished upward into the open sky. People learned that stillness could be more dangerous than motion. A small striking habit appears in several accounts from these quiet hours. Some settlers deliberately waited before rising, testing the air with a bare hand or foot first. The sensation guided their next move, too sharp, and they stayed still longer, conserving warmth. Movement was delayed until it could be done deliberately. There is disagreement among modern climate historians about why post-storm cold felt so severe. Some point to clear skies allowing heat to escape. Others emphasize exhaustion after prolonged vigilance. Both explanations find support in the records. From within the experience, the effect is unmistakable. You feel the cold now as something clean and hard rather than biting. It does not rush, it settles. This makes the room feel strangely empty. Sound travels farther. Each breath seems louder. It is documented that people often checked on others during this quiet period before fully waking. A hand placed gently on a shoulder, a whisper of a name. Silence demanded confirmation. Sleep after a storm felt fragile. An unexpected detail emerges from one winter diary. A man wrote that the silence after a blizzard felt louder than the storm itself, because it left room for thoughts to return. Worry crept back in. During the storm, survival was immediate. Afterward, reflection resumed. You notice how your own thoughts begin to stir. Morning approaches, though light has not yet returned. The body senses change even before the eyes do. Some researchers suggest that these silent hours shaped how people remembered winter. Storms were dramatic, but it was the stillness afterward that lingered in memory. Others argue exhaustion dulled perception by then. Accounts vary, but the pause remains a common thread. As the fire fades to embers, the room holds its breath. No one moves yet. This moment belongs to listening, to feeling, to waiting. You remain still, wrapped in layers, aware that the storm has passed but winter remains. The silence does not promise comfort. It offers a brief chance to rest without interruption. In the frontier, night quiet was never empty. It carried information. It signaled change. And in that stillness, sleep lingered a little longer, cautious but intact, before morning demanded its due. As the room settles into that deep quiet, your thoughts drift toward meanings people once carried into the night. When warmth failed and certainty thinned, belief often stepped in, not loudly, not with sermons, but with small gestures that made sleep feel less exposed. On the winter frontier, faith and superstition blended easily. Diaries, letters, and oral recollections show that many people turned to familiar rituals before sleep during the coldest months. A short prayer whispered under breath, a phrase repeated from childhood. These actions did not change the temperature, but they changed how the night was faced. You feel how this works. The body relaxes when the mind feels anchored. Cold isolates. Ritual reconnects. Even simple repetition steadies breathing, slows thoughts, and eases the transition into rest. One quietly telling habit appears in several frontier households. Objects believed to offer protection were placed near sleeping areas. A small Bible, a charm sewn into fabric, a family heirloom tucked beneath bedding. These items rarely appear in official records, but they surface in personal writing, mentioned almost casually as if their presence required no explanation. There's no single agreement among historians about how widespread such practices truly were. Some argue frontier life hardened people, leaving little room for superstition. Others point to overwhelming evidence that uncertainty encouraged belief rather than erased it. What is clear is that nights made room for thoughts that daylight pushed aside. You notice how darkness amplifies imagination. Sounds feel closer, shadows stretch further. In this environment, belief became a way to frame fear, to give it boundaries. Sleep arrived more easily when fear had a name and a response. It is known that some families mark the sleeping space itself. Beds were arranged facing certain directions. Children were taught to cross themselves before lying down. These actions varied by background and culture, but the intent was similar. They transformed sleep from vulnerability into routine. A small but striking detail appears in a letter written by a woman wintering far from neighbours. She described speaking aloud to the room before sleep naming each person present, reassuring herself that everyone was accounted for. The words were not meant for others. They were meant for her own mind. You feel how this kind of reassurance works. Naming things makes them feel stable. Cold thrives on uncertainty. Routine pushes back. Some scholars suggest that these beliefs offered psychological warmth rather than physical benefit. Others argue reduced anxiety improved rest and therefore survival. The distinction is difficult to draw. When sleep deepens, the reason matters less than the result. As you lie there, thoughts soften. The night feels less adversarial. Belief does not erase danger, but it reshapes how danger is held. You breathe more evenly now. The silence feels contained. The cold remains, but it no longer fills the entire space of awareness. On the frontier, faith and superstition did not promise miracles. They promised steadiness. They gave people something to do with their fear before sleep took it away for a few hours. You drift again, carried not by certainty but by familiarity. In winter, familiarity was comfort enough. You wake slowly, not because you feel rested, but because your body needs to check itself. This was how mornings often began in winter, carefully, deliberately. Sleep released its hold in stages, and each stage came with quiet assessment. People who lived through frontier winters rarely sprang from bed. Waking was a process. Accounts from homesteads and military posts describe people lying still for several moments after opening their eyes, testing sensation before moving. Fingers flexed beneath blankets. Toes wiggled slightly. Pain or numbness sent clear messages. The body reported its condition before the day was allowed to begin. You do the same now. Sensation returns unevenly. Pins and needles creep through your hands. A dull ache settles in joints. These feelings are familiar, almost reassuring. Sharp pain would be worse. No sensation at all would be alarming. A small but revealing routine appears in many winter diaries. People often spoke aloud first thing in the morning, even if no one else was present. A greeting, a comment on the cold, a simple word. Sound confirmed breath. Breath confirmed life. It grounded the body before movement. There is still discussion among historians about how often people lost digits or limbs to frost injury versus how often damage healed unnoticed. Medical records from the period are incomplete. Some injuries were recorded only when they became disabling. Others were absorbed quietly into daily life. What is certain is that morning checks mattered. You notice how the room feels colder now than it did during the night. Fires burned low. Bodies had been still for hours. The warmth generated by movement and digestion had faded. Morning demanded action to restore heat. It is known that people rose in layers, not shedding bedding all at once. Blankets were folded back gradually. One leg extended, then returned. Sudden exposure could shock cold skin. Carefulness preserved energy. An unexpected detail appears in one settler's account. He wrote that he judged the severity of the morning by how long it took his breath to feel painful when inhaled. That sensation became a scale more reliable than any instrument he owned. You feel your breath now. It bites lightly, not unbearable, manageable. That assessment informs your next move. Some scholars suggest these slow mornings trained people to listen closely to their bodies in ways modern life rarely requires. Others argue exhaustion dulled awareness over time. Both ideas appear in personal writings. Some settlers became deeply attuned to physical signals. Others pushed through discomfort until injury forced rest. You sit up gradually. Blood shifts. The room tilts briefly, then steadies. People learned to expect this and waited it out rather than rushing. Falls were dangerous. Cold floors unforgiving. There is a quiet moment recorded in several family letters. A parent checking each child's hands and face before allowing them to rise fully. Colour returned meant warmth. Pale skin meant caution. Mornings were about confirmation as much as preparation. As you prepare to move, you feel the night's toll clearly. Sleep has carried you through, but it has not restored you completely. That was normal. Rest here was functional, not luxurious. The day will bring movement. Movement will bring warmth. But first comes this moment. Assessment. Awareness. Gratitude that sleep ended with waking. On the winter frontier, mornings were earned slowly. Each one confirmed that the night had been endured, and that more than comfort was what sleep was meant to provide. As days shortened and winters repeated themselves, something deeper began to change. Not just habits, but expectations. You feel it now in the way your body no longer resists the cold as sharply as it once did. It does not welcome it, but it understands it. People who lived through multiple frontier winters often wrote about this shift. Early seasons were described as shocking, overwhelming, almost unbearable. Later ones sounded different, still difficult but familiar. Sleep patterns adjusted. What once felt intolerable became routine. Not because the cold softened, but because people learned where they could bend without breaking. You notice how quickly your body settles now compared to earlier nights. Muscles still tense, but release comes faster. Breathing finds rhythm sooner. The mind spends less time fighting the situation and more time working within it. Adaptation shows itself quietly. A revealing detail appears in letters written several years apart by the same settlers. Early entries complain of sleepless nights and constant waking. Later entries mention cold almost in passing, focusing instead on dreams, thoughts, or the coming day. The environment remained harsh, but attention shifted. Sleep became less of an event and more of a background process. There is no complete agreement among historians about whether this adaptation was psychological or physical. Some point to acclimatization, changes in metabolism, and improved routines. Others emphasize mindset, arguing that familiarity reduced anxiety and allowed deeper rest. Both forces likely work together, reinforcing each other over time. You feel how routine itself creates comfort. Knowing what to expect removes surprise. Surprise wastes energy. On the frontier, energy was guarded carefully. It is recorded that families who survived several winters often modified their shelters and sleeping arrangements incrementally. Extra layers added to walls, bedding improved slowly, fire management refined. Each change was small, but together they reshaped the night. Sleep improved not because conditions transformed, but because responses did. An unexpected observation comes from a settler, who noted that his dreams changed after years of winter hardship. Early dreams were frantic. Later ones became calmer even during cold spells. The mind learned that not every discomfort signaled danger. Sleep followed that lesson. You sense this now. The cold still presses, but it no longer fills your entire awareness. Thoughts wander, memories surface, rest deepens. Some scholars question whether this adaptation masked long-term harm. Joints stiffened permanently, lungs weakened, fatigue accumulated. Others argue that human flexibility allowed many to endure without lasting damage. Accounts support both interpretations. Survival did not mean escaping cost. It meant choosing which costs could be carried. You adjust your position, slightly confident now in how much movement you can afford. The body remembers these limits. Learning them took time. Remembering them keeps you safe. There is a quiet pride woven through later frontier writings. Not boasting, but steadiness. The tone of someone who has learned something difficult and no longer needs to announce it. Sleep once feared became manageable. As you drift again, you recognize that winter reshaped more than nights. It reshaped people. Expectations lowered. Resilience grew. The cold remained indifferent, but those who slept through it learned how to meet it on their own terms. Rest comes easier now. Not because conditions improved, but because you have changed. And on the frontier, that shift often mattered more than anything else. Stories begin to surface as the winter wears on. Not told loudly, not all at once, They emerge in fragments shared during quiet moments when the fire holds and the wind eases. You feel their hinted presence even as you lie down now, aware that sleep on the frontier carried memory as well as fatigue. People remembered nights that tested them, and those memories shaped how later nights were faced. Journals and oral recollections show that winter experiences quickly turned into shared reference points. A storm everyone recalled, a night when the fire nearly failed, a morning when someone did not wake as expected. These stories were not entertainment, they were instruction. You notice how remembering changes posture. People adjusted bedding based on what they had learned before. Someone would mention how snow entered from a particular corner, and that corner would be reinforced next time. Stories became tools. A small but telling custom appears in several family accounts. After especially harsh nights, people recounted the details aloud, the following evening almost replaying the experience. This repetition was not dwelling on fear, it was reinforcement. By naming what happened, they made it manageable. There remains uncertainty among historians about how much these shared memories improved survival versus simply bonding communities. Some suggest that storytelling helped distribute practical knowledge quickly. Others argue the emotional reassurance mattered just as much. Within the night itself, the distinction fades. Feeling prepared often feels like being prepared. You sense how stories linger in the room even when no one speaks. They inform where you lie, how tightly you wrap yourself when you wake to tend the fire. Experience accumulates quietly. It is widely observed that frontier communities developed a shared winter vocabulary, specific terms for certain winds, names for types of cold. These words allowed people to communicate risk efficiently. Saying one phrase conveyed an entire night's worth of knowledge. Language shortened fear. An unexpected detail appears in one settler's journal. He wrote that after surviving a severe winter, he slept better the following year simply because he knew it was possible. That knowledge carried weight. Sleep improved through confidence rather than comfort. You feel that effect now. Memory steadies you. The night feels less unknown. Even discomfort feels familiar. Some scholars question whether repeated storytelling hardened people to danger, making them less cautious over time. Others argue it sharpened awareness, keeping risks visible without panic. Evidence suggests both outcomes occurred depending on personality and circumstance. You adjust your bedding slightly, recalling a detail from earlier nights. The movement is precise, practiced. You do not need to think it through. Experience guides you. Stories also softened isolation. Knowing others had endured similar nights made solitude less absolute. Sleep felt shared across time, not just space. As the fire dims and the room settles, these memories hover gently at the edge of thought. They do not intrude, they reassure. Sleep arrives with less resistance when the mind believes it knows what is coming. On the winter frontier, stories were not told to pass time. They were told to prepare the body for rest. They reminded people that the night, however difficult, had been faced before, and that knowledge carried quietly into sleep made endurance feel possible once again. When warmth finally returns, it does so cautiously. Not as a sudden gift, but as a gradual easing. You sense it first in the morning air, slightly less sharp, slightly more forgiving. Spring does not erase winter on the frontier. It loosens it one small signal at a time. People who survived these seasons often wrote about mistrusting early warmth. A soft day did not mean safe nights. Snow could return suddenly. Cold could reassert itself without warning. Sleep habits formed in winter lingered long after necessity faded. Layers stayed close. Fires were watched carefully. Caution remained part of rest. You feel this hesitation now. Even as the air softens, your body does not fully relax. Memory keeps it alert. This carried forward in many frontier households. Winter shaped sleep beyond the season itself. Records from settlements show that spring nights were often colder indoors than expected. Melting snow dampened walls. Ground released cold slowly. People continued sleeping as they had in winter, knowing comfort could vanish overnight. Experience taught patience. A small revealing detail appears in one settler's letter, written after a long winter finally broke. He described sleeping poorly during the first warm nights because silence replaced familiar wind. The absence of struggle felt strange. Rest took time to relearn. There is still discussion among historians about whether these winters left lasting psychological marks. Some accounts suggest heightened anxiety lingered. Others indicate relief and forgetfulness once warmth returned. The truth varied. Some carried winter with them. Others set it down quickly. You sense how your own body responds. Muscles ease but not completely. Sleep deepens but awareness remains. The night feels less hostile but not entirely friendly. It is known that as spring approached, people slowly dismantled winter sleeping arrangements. Extra bedding removed gradually. Fires allowed to fade earlier, but nothing happened all at once. Change was cautious, earned step by step. An unexpected habit emerges in several springtime accounts. Settlers often kept winter bedding close by even when not in use, reluctant to store it away. The memory of cold made preparedness feel comforting. You rest now with that same instinct. The night feels gentler, yet the lessons of winter remain close. Sleep becomes something you trust again, but not blindly. Some scholars believe that surviving these winters reshaped people's relationship with rest itself. Sleep became purposeful, valued, never taken for granted. Others argue the experience hardened people, making comfort less important. Both impressions appear in the records, sometimes within the same individual. You feel gratitude settle quietly. Not joy, not celebration, just acknowledgement. The night passed. You slept. Morning arrived. The frontier does not reward endurance with ease. It simply allows continuation. That was enough. As you drift toward the final moments of this story, you recognize that sleep during the coldest years of the Wild West was not about escape. It was about alignment, aligning body habit, shelter, and awareness just enough to carry life forward. Winter shaped how people slept, and in doing so, it shaped who they became. Now the night grows softer again. Your breathing slows without effort. The cold that once demanded attention fades into the background, no longer sharp, no longer urgent. You imagine the frontier at rest, fires low, animals settle the land itself, pausing between seasons. You have walked through nights of wind-hunger vigilance and quiet resilience. You have felt how sleep became something earned rather than assumed, and now you no longer need to hold that awareness so tightly. Let the body loosen. Let the shoulders drop. Let the mind drift without measuring warmth or listening for danger. The lessons of the night can rest with you without effort. Picture the embers dimming safely, the room steady, the air calm. Nothing needs adjusting now, nothing needs watching. Sleep does not have to work tonight. It can simply arrive. You are warm enough. You are still. The night holds without pressing in. And as thoughts soften and fade, the story closes gently around you. Sweet dreams.